Hi, welcome to the next lecture in the Introduction to Philosophy class, this one entitled The First Attempts at Explanation. As we saw last time, the ancient Greeks were, for the most part, telling stories about how things came to be and why things in nature occur as they do. But around this time, and that is around 600, 700 BC, you start seeing either a dissatisfaction with storytelling per se, or with the first attempts to figure out how one could tell if a story is credible, believable, or true. And the people who first did this were a group of philosophers which we now call pre-Socratics, because they were around prior to Socrates. A lot of times people think that Socrates is the first Western philosopher because of the extent of his notoriety or popularity, but that's not the case at all. There were a number of people who were around before Socrates who were asking a number of questions and trying to see if there was a way to figure out what is actually the case, rather than what some group of people have said is the case in some story or tale. In trying to figure out how we know if a story is right or true, the pre-Socratics dealt with, among other things, three interrelated questions, which we can think of as how individual objects in the world are related to the world as a whole. How can we tell the difference between something seeming to be the case and it's really being so? This is become in philosophy known as the reality-appearance distinction. And how do people fit into all of this? One of the odd things about people, and really what's meant by that is the subject we addressed as human nature, is if we were to think of the universe as a single object, there'll be more on that later, whose parts are all related to it as a whole, or comprise the whole of the universe. The people in it can be thought of as that many more parts. The odd thing about people, though, is that they are the ones trying to put this puzzle together. So there's something like a completeness problem. How can the part put together a puzzle that it itself is one of the parts of? And of course that creates problems when it comes to something really being the case and something seeming to be the case. That is the second question. When the pre-Socratics open this can of worms, they find that when they try to answer one question, it creates problems with respect to another of the questions. There are times we'll see that someone thinks they've got one aspect of it answered, only to see that they've left some other part unaddressed, or that they've created some other problem they hadn't seen at the outset. The first person we know of to do this kind of thing was named Thales, and lived around 600 BC. He lived in the city of what was then called Miletus, which is in what is now western or southwestern Turkey. And this is a picture of some of what's left of this city. You can tell that this is well over 2,500 years ago. We're talking about a place of great grandeur, whose heyday is long gone. But it's the starting place, as far as we know, of Western philosophy. And Thales made what for us would seem a very odd claim, and that is that all things are made of water. Thales was trying to give some sort of basic description of the universe as a whole, and said that he thought that basically all things are made of or comprised of water. And he gave a couple of reasons for it. The first one was that water changes states, that is, from a liquid to a solid to a gas. In Greece, which is can be a very hot part of the world, you can watch puddles of water, as you can in any place with low humidity. You can watch a shallow puddle of water evaporate, and you can also see the steam rise up off the ground as the puddle evaporates. So you can literally watch the transition from a liquid to a gas. And because Greece is mountainous, there are times when the snow could literally be, you can literally watch the snow and ice melt and turn into water. So the transition between the three states is quite obvious. It doesn't require a whole lot of scientific experimentation to observe those changes. It's also necessary for life. Not only if I'm a farmer out in Greece do I need to make sure that I water my crops and give water to my livestock, but as a farmer out here in Greece, I very quickly realize that I too need it. And I notice that when I drink the water, it becomes part of me. Just as when I water my plants, I can, if I've got any patience, I can stand there and literally see them absorb the water and go from a wilted state to looking healthy and lively again. The same, of course, with my goats or whatever animals I might have. So for both of these reasons, Thales is thinking basically this whole thing, this whole world seems to be water. And as we've seen from the map of ancient Greece, we could also sort of give him an implicit reason, and that is that water surrounds all of the land masses. In one sense, not knowing yet that we're on a planet, we might think, if I walk far enough, I'll see that I'm basically just on an island. In Greece, there are tons of islands, so I could literally walk around something and see that water surrounds the entire island. And if I'm on the mainland of Turkey, it may be that I just haven't walked far enough. If I just keep walking, I'll see that ultimately water surrounds everything. And of course, now that we have a sense of Earth from space, we can see that most of, about 70% of the Earth's surface is covered with water. But not yet knowing that he's on a planet, he might well have assumed that water lies underneath. I mean, we know that there's molten magma inside, beneath the crust of the Earth, but even if we just literally took it as water, Thales might have assumed that beneath the land that he's standing on, something has to be holding this up, and may have assumed that that too is water. So this is a first jab at sort of saying how things literally are, rather than telling a story in terms of the characters of Olympus. And it's this that makes Thales the first Western philosopher, because Thales is the first person to make a claim about how the world is, or how he believes it to be, and to give reasons for why that claim ought to be considered true. Now, in one sense, it doesn't matter whether Thales' claim is true or not. To make him the first Western philosopher, he literally just has to make a claim and then give reasons why anyone, including himself, should consider it credible. And this is the first instance of an argument in the philosophical sense, rather than just telling a story. If someone, as we've seen earlier, makes a claim and then provides reasons for it, that constitutes an argument. So now this gives something that one can take issue with and literally say, wait a second, this may not be the case, but if it's not the case, we know why. As we'll see, it's because either one of your premises is incorrect, or you're not arguing in a logical manner. But at least now Thales has presented us with the first argument about how the world actually is. In contrast, if someone were to say in a story, imagine you're reading a novel or watching a film, and someone, including even the author, should break into the middle of it and start telling you why you ought to believe that the characters in the book are real, or that the places in the story are real, etc. All it's really going to do is upset the narrative. It's going to make it a bad story. We just suspend disbelief when we listen to stories or watch films, because we're not interested in proving that the characters are real. We're interested in what happens. And that was the case with the myths of Greece And now Thales is trying a whole another procedure by saying, in effect, I think I actually am making a claim about how the world is, rather than just telling you stories about particular characters. However, Thales also made the claim that all things are, as he put it, filled with gods. And it might be that we think he's making a concession to his contemporaries, that he's trying not to shift too radically, or for fear that he wouldn't be understood by the people around him, and is saying everything's basically water, but there's still the gods of Olympus and all that. But instead, what Thales seems to be getting at is there's some force inside objects that causes them to do the things that they do. So in the case of water, something must be causing water to change states, and it's not something that's extrinsic to water, it's something that's actually in it, that's causing water to have the properties that it does. For example, something must enable water's absorption into the bodies of organic objects. And so we think that when Thales says that all things are filled with gods, he's trying to get at the forces of nature. He's trying to say there are things we can't see here that are causing things to go the way they go, the kinds of laws of nature that people like physicists and chemists and biologists are today still trying to spell out. So in effect, what Thales is saying is, rather than look to the gods on Mount Olympus, if one wants to know why things are the way they are, and ultimately how things are, one needs to look at the things themselves. And oddly enough, that's what makes him also, in addition to being the first philosopher, the first natural scientist. Whereas, in order to be the first philosopher, Thales had to make a claim and then give reasons in support of it. In order to be considered the first natural scientist, Thales had to say that natural phenomena must be explained in terms of natural phenomena. In other words, if I see something happening in the world, I don't look somewhere other than to the world for the explanation. The explanation of natural phenomena are not to be found anywhere but in nature. So this gives us the beginning of the kind of thinking that we call empirical, or we'll see when we get to Aristotle, the beginnings of empiricism. So rather than looking for ultimate causes of things in the intentions of the gods of Olympus, we have to look at the phenomena themselves. If, in Thales' case, he went down to some river or creek near Miletus, and he saw water and thought, why is water transparent? Why is water drinkable? Why do I have to drink it? Why, when I'm here at the creek, does the water always flow in one direction? All of those answers, Thales is contending, are to be gotten from the phenomena themselves. In other words, if you want to figure out why the world is the way the world is, you need to look at the objects of the world, the natural phenomena themselves, in order to discern their properties. That's the kind of thinking that today we would call experimentation and observation. You're literally going to look at the world, possibly fool around with it a little bit to get it to do one thing rather than another, and see if you can understand what Thales is calling the gods, i.e. the natural forces that are at work that make the object or the element the way that it is. Now, immediately, as soon as Thales makes this claim, even while he's giving reasons or justifications for it, we get one of the most important aspects of the discipline of philosophy, and that is criticism. A guy by the name of Anaximander, from the same town as Thales, and around the same time as Thales, has both positive and negative things to say about it. But the important thing for us is that criticism is not a negative thing in philosophy. We'll see this especially when we get to the section on Socrates, any more than argument is. Today we might use the word argument to mean something like a fight that people are having. And in the same way we might use the word criticism as something synonymous with name calling, or something pejorative that one might say or do about someone else. But the point of criticism in philosophy is to see where the strengths and weaknesses of an argument lie. So Anaximander finds certain things that Thales has said worthwhile, and others in need of some degree of work. And here's a map that'll give you an idea of just where these two folks are beginning to sort of sketch out the problems with which philosophy will be concerned with for the next 2.5, 3 millennia. If you look at the left-hand side of the map there, where Miletus is, just under the city of Ephesus, this part is now, of course, Western Turkey. But at the time, we didn't have the type of political boundaries that we do now, and so Greek culture, or cultures of various peoples, were mixed together around the Aegean Sea, with Greece off to the left of what we can see here. But this is, to the best of our knowledge, something like the birthplace of Western philosophy. As for Anaximander's criticism of Thales, he thinks that a naturalistic approach, like the one that Thales takes, is good for explaining physical changes, the kinds of things that we mentioned about water's changing states, its absorption into organic objects like ourselves, but not for what Anaximander called opposition. In other words, it's hard to say how something like water explains dryness. What he's thinking is something like this. Someone could use something other than water as an example. In very short amount of time, people did do that. They said the world is made of fire, or the world is made of earth, and of course, where we get our primordial elements of earth, wind, and fire, are people trying to, in a very rudimentary sense, say it's one or the other, or no, it's a combination of all these, and that kind of thing. But if you pick any natural element, according to Anaximander, that thing can't tell you anything about the things that seem opposed to it. I could, for example, say that fire is extremely rarefied water, but it seems then that I'm pushing the explanation of natural phenomena to an extreme to which it doesn't really go. There's nothing about fire that strikes me as rarefied water. And again, what we're trying to give is an explanation, not just say something and then do everything we can to pretend that that something is true. So while Anaximander agrees with the naturalistic approach of Thales for the changes in the natural world, the likes of which we just mentioned, the thing that he doesn't like, and he doesn't just mean it for Thales, he means it for any particular example like water. He thinks that no natural element, nothing we might find in nature like water, could account either for the properties that that element has, or for that element's own existence. And the reason that he thinks this is because anything you pick in nature is going to be limited in space and time. That is, it may take up an enormous amount of space, or it may have existed for a very long time, but anything that's actual, any part of the world, Anaximander is contending, has to be finite. And so for that reason, it can't possibly account either for its own properties or for its existence in general. Even Thales' example of water, for example, is, we might think it ludicrous to think that everything in the world is water, but let's say that he had picked a slightly different example. Today we claim that the most prevalent element in the universe is hydrogen. If Thales, by some fluke, long before the advent of chemistry, if Thales had said all things are made of hydrogen, well, he still would have been wrong because of the word all. Not everything in the world is made of hydrogen. But Anaximander's point would still be right in that regardless of how much hydrogen there is in the world, and it is an enormous amount, it's still a finite amount. And so in one sense what Anaximander is saying is there's no way for hydrogen to account for the properties hydrogen has or for why there's hydrogen at all. And so the criticism he's making of Thales one could still make today with respect to an explanation that used natural phenomena like, in this case, water. Anaximander's own argument goes something like this. He's saying any object in nature is finite, even if it's extremely large. Take any object or element and it's got spatial limits. It only takes up this much space, however big this is. And it also only takes up this much time, so it must have a begin and an end in time. That means that something other than that thing must have been the cause of the thing. Since this is true of all objects in nature, then saying that one thing in nature causes another must come to an end. That is, I could say that if I were to use the example of people, that you were caused by your parents, and your parents were caused by their parents, and their parents were caused by their parents, etc. But at some point, Anaximander is saying, for people like any other object in the world, there would have to be some originary explanation, something that got the whole ball rolling. You're not going to be, this is sometimes referred to as chicken and egg scenarios, you're not going to be able to explain the thing that you're trying to explain by saying that something else like the thing I'm trying to explain must be the explanation. And so something, Anaximander is claiming, that does not have such limits in terms of space and time must be the original cause of all the things that do. For that reason, Anaximander postulates the idea of the boundless, which you can think of as something that is a beginning for all things, but which does not itself have a beginning. Something, Anaximander is contending, must exist that is not limited in space and not limited in time. It's infinite with respect to what today we might call space and time or space-time. And that's the something or other. He uses the word in Greek for boundless, the infinite, which creates a world. Because one of the things that people even today still speculate about is why there is a world rather than not. Why is there something rather than nothing? It seems a whole lot easier, so to speak, to not have a universe than to have one, especially given how enormous the universe is. Anaximander claims that the boundless not only gets the ball rolling, so to speak, in generating the world, but it also guides and steers all things. And by that he means something like it provides the constraints that we think of today as the laws of physics. So in one sense he agrees with Thales that all things are filled with gods, if that means natural forces, but he thinks that the forces of nature are determined by, either were determined by at the outset or determined constantly throughout the world's existence by this boundless. That means that the individual objects in the world, its parts, are the result of the way that the universe moves as a whole. And when you and I use the term universe, we are suggesting as much. He suggests that there's a type of vortex motion, kind of a spinning that the universe as a whole is exhibiting, and is claiming in effect that the way that this one thing, this universe spins, is producing the individual parts and producing them the way that we experience them in a unified form. That is, because the universe moves as a single thing, so to speak, its parts are necessarily related to one another as parts. They're not free to leave the universe or not participate in its motion and all that kind of thing. So when you and I use the term universe, we're saying, in effect, without always thinking of the etymology, that there is this one thing, that all the parts comprise a single whole, and that one thing is turning or moving. So if we think of the word universe meaning one turning, we get something like that vortex motion that Anaximander is talking about. A single object which is turning and causing or generating the individual objects or parts as we perceive them. Now, with respect to the vortex motion itself, one might think of something like taking some dirt or sand and spinning it around in a dish or a pail. In an earlier time when kids didn't have electric gadgets to play with, Game Boys and iPhones and that kind of stuff, if they took a pail and went down to play in the sand along a coastline or at a lake or something like that, you can take a bunch of water and put it into this pan and move it around, and the vortex motion that gets generated is the kind of thing that Anaximander has in mind. You'll see there'll be a clumping together of certain things and a separating out of one thing from another. And so if we thought of that on a large scale, we might, in a scale as large as the universe, we might say, well, why isn't the universe uniform? In other words, why isn't matter distributed in a completely uniform kind of paste, let's say? Why are there clumps of galaxies with millions or even billions of stars clustered together in one spot, and then vast areas where there's nothing? And what Anaximander is saying is it's attributable to the motion that the entire thing is exhibiting. So while we may think of objects being on their own or distinct in some way, what Anaximander is trying to show us is that all things in the world are related one to another by the laws that govern their motion, and those laws are the product of the way this one thing turns as a whole. So he's both agreeing with and disagreeing with Thales, saying that there are laws which guide and steer this, and they're in the things, they're in the world themselves. They're not external to it, but they act in a way that is something greater than any individual part, like water. There's a difference in scope, you might say. Anaximander thinks we need to be looking far beyond any particular natural element in order to explain why that element, or any element for that matter, has the nature that it does. This leads to the contention by Anaximander that there's something like a principle of balance in the world. At least that's what he calls it. And the idea he has in mind is that to get one thing you have to give up something else. So if you think to the issue of Thales not being able to explain opposition through his suggestion that all things are water, or anyone else's contention at the time that all things are fire, etc. Anaximander is not just saying that you can't explain dry things with water. He's saying something like, to the extent that one makes something dry, they must give up something wet. So if someone were turning on hot versus cold water, for example, to the extent that you make it hot, you lose the cold. And of course that's what you want to do when you turn on more hot water. In the same way, if you wanted something to dry, you would do whatever you could to get the water out of it. You want it to not be wet. So to the extent that something becomes dry, it stops being wet. To the extent that something gets hot, it stops being cold. You can't have it both ways at the same time. So this is an early version of saying something like, two things can't occupy the same place at the same time. Anaximander is saying, in effect, not just as some texts contend that whenever you have a hot winter, you're going to have a hot summer, you're going to have a cold winter. That really just tells me that summers are hot and winters are cold, and that things can often shift from one extreme to another. What Anaximander is really saying is, if you're going to get summer or winter, you have to give the other one up. And the reason you have to give the other one up is because they are made of the same stuff. If you think of a timeline, and you said, in order to get from the summer of this year to the winter going into the next year, things are going to have to change around here. Things are going to have to cool down, and we'll have to go through all kinds of seasonal changes until we get to winter. The reason for that is, remembering that vortex motion and the changes of the world itself, what he's saying is the stuff that makes up winter today is the same stuff, so to speak, the same matter, one might say today, that was making up summer before. So I might, for example, think, I love the way things are right now in whatever year this is. But because of that, because I understand this principle of balance and vortex motion he's talking about, I can't expect things to stay the way they are now, because the change that he's talking about, this vortex motion, necessarily means that the parts of which summer and winter are one, so to speak, the changes that result, that I see as seasonal, are the result of the stuff, the objects around me here on Earth, literally going through changes so that things get colder. There, in that case, are going to be temperature changes. But if I said, I liked it the way it was back in the 20th century, can't we stay there? The answer is no. The 20th century has to be given up to make way, so to speak, for the 21st century. But the things, sticking to things here on Earth, the way things are now in the 21st century are the way they are because of the way they were in the 20th century. And those things were the way they were because of the way things were in the 19th century, and so on. So because of the unity of all things in this universe, Anaximander is contending that not only do things change over time, but they are the same things. So if I thought of this on a large scale and I said, take it back 14 billion years to when scientists today contend, just under 14 billion years ago, there was a big bang, so where all of the world's matter was contained in a very small clump, what some describe as a singularity, a single mass of things that then explodes and expands out into the world that we know today. If I think of all of the objects, including Earth and us on it, as part of that process, then what Anaximander is saying is there is a principle of balance to how that change happens over time, to time itself. So what he thinks is there's a lesson to be learned there. Once I understand that there is a principle of balance, that things can't or shouldn't go too far in any one direction, then I will know, I'll learn some things about how to moderate my own behavior. If one wants the world as a whole to contain them in the future, that is, if I want the universe to be configured so that I'm one of its parts in the future, then I had better moderate my behavior. I haven't always existed, I won't always exist, and if I want to say, not only in this year, but in subsequent years, I want to be an individual object, an individual part, so to speak, of the universe, then I need to pay attention to how this thing moves, to what we might think of as the laws of nature, in order to increase the chances that I will be one of its components somewhere down the line. So because we're able to, and we'll get into this more later, because we're able to modify our own behavior and do things that are beneficial for ourselves, then we can learn this. In other words, I think about big cosmological issues like how the world works precisely because I'm one of the objects in it. And wanting to remain one of the objects in it, I do all the things necessary to preserve myself as an organism. Now, from Anaximander's point of view, he thinks this is extremely important, not just because of wanting to preserve oneself and the relation between an individual object like a person and the world as a whole, but because he thinks that the nature of explanation requires it, whereas Thales thinks that by explaining how things are comprised of a single element, in his case water, Anaximander thinks you haven't gone far enough. You need, in order to give an explanation of how things are, you also have to give an explanation of why things are. In other words, why there's a world at all, and why that world has the particular properties or characteristics that it does. This last point is important not just for the distinction between Thales and Anaximander, who are our two first Western philosophers, but because of the difference that they exhibit about the nature of explanation itself. Each of these people exemplify a way of thinking about the nature of explanation that's not only different from one from another, but is also remained throughout the history of Western thought. The first one we typically today refer to as reductionism. A reductionist is someone who thinks that explanation requires the reducing of a plurality of phenomena down to one or just a few. That is, if I think of the unbelievable number of things that there are in the world, if I'm a reductionist, I think that explaining them means figuring out the small number of laws that cause them to be the way they are, or the small number of elements or particles that explain their overall nature. If I've done that, then I've given a full explanation of the phenomena in question. An example of that we might see in school today is something like a chemistry class. If we go into a chemistry class and see the chart on the wall at the front of almost all chemistry classes, which is the periodic table, we might say to ourselves, if we're thinking like chemists, there isn't anything in the universe that you can find that's not made of these 100 and some odd elements. There are still a couple that we expect to find, but once the periodic table is complete, we will have all of the elements for anything in the universe. That's an example of reductionist thinking. So that if I say here's 100 and some elements, granted it's more than just the one that Thales has, or what some people might think of as a few, but we might say that's it. That's all the building blocks, so to speak, that you have to work with. So when someone does what Thales has done, or what a chemist would be doing when he or she says all phenomena are explicable in terms of this small set of basic components, that's reductionism. By contrast, someone like Anaximander wants to know, as we saw in his criticism of Thales, why there is whatever is being claimed there is, whatever these basic components are, and why those components have the properties they do. So what I'm here calling creationism is really not what today we would think of creationism, because we're talking about a time prior to the Judeo-Christian tradition. Someone in this sense of thinking about explanation considers them sufficient only if the ultimate origin of the world, that is, the existence of the universe or its constituents, the elements, forces, particles that they're reducing things to, is accounted for as well. So if a chemist, just to stick with the same example, said everything in the world must be made of these X number of chemical elements. Someone like Anaximander would want to say, where did those come from? And why is it that they have the characteristics they do? I can't say, if someone gives me an element like water, that if someone asks, why is there water? I can't reply, water. Water can't be its own explanation, so to speak. Or if I ask, why does water have the properties it does, as Thales was asking, I can't then say water as a response. And Anaximander and people like him think that's true of any phenomenon. If you ask someone why photons and neutrons and electrons work the way they do, I can't just repeat the words photons, neutrons, and electrons. There must be something that's making those things have the characteristics that they have, and perhaps most importantly, making them exist at all, which is why I'm using the word creationism here. It's something that will give something like an ultimate explanation or an ultimate account of why things are at all. And so Thales and Anaximander are not only the first two Western philosophers, they give us the basic the two basic ways that people seek explanation. And we're still divided today into camps of people who, for example, natural scientists, who want to say, if I can basically tell you how the physical, chemical, and biological principles of the world work and how they all fit together, then we've given a complete account of the nature of the universe. And those people who want to say physics itself breaks down at the point of the Big Bang, and so there's no way for physics to do the work that it does prior to that time, and no way for us to say why there was a universe here to explode and expand over these 14 billion years. So we've got both camps still with us today. So these initial philosophers have given us more than just an account of everything is basically made of water or the boundless. They've given us a completely different way of thinking about the world, as opposed to the tales that were being told before in the myths and legends of ancient Greece.